Hello, everybody. We're about ready to get started here for our first presentation of our winter 2024 season. We are going to be having a series of presenters over the next couple months, doing educational talks about geysers, Yellowstone items, and other geysers abroad. Our first presenter is Art Haeussler, and he is going to be presenting about radio technology. And we will give it over to Art.
All right. Well, if everybody can hear us all right, let us know in the chat. But assuming things are going well, I'll just get right into it. Threw up here just the rest of the presentations that we have scheduled. Again, schedule subject to change, but again, we'll continue to post them here on YouTube. Next slide here. So I always have to lead with a presentation like this with a little bit of a disclaimer. Technology is always evolving, always changing, and so do the rules and standards that are set by the local, state, federal government. So again, just as technology is always evolving, and so do the interpretation of those rules. So some of the stuff that's in this presentation, if we had done this presentation 2 years ago, it would have been different information. So as always, this goal of this is to try to educate folks, and that's a two-way street. So if folks have feedback on things that they find that are incorrect or things that are need to be redone, just let me know, and we'll make updates to it, and be more than happy to do this presentation again next year as things change. So quick intro about myself. So Art Haeussler, live in New Hampshire with my wife Larissa and our daughter Clara. We've been coming to the park since 2012, and I think one of the first things we noticed when we got there was, wow, your phones don't work really well here, and everybody's running around with two-way radios and walkie-talkies, and you got more and more around the park, and you realize there wasn't a lot of coverage for cell phones, and two-way radios were still a very popular thing. So we're gonna hopefully share some of those things that we've learned over the years and explain exactly what are these radios, what's the technology that they run on, what are these terminologies. We'll cover a little bit about some of the gear and stuff that's out there. Again, there's some best practices, and we'll turn it over to some Q&A here at the end. So what radios, what sort of systems are in place in the park and the regular area, right? So everybody's using frequency and spectrum, and it's kind of like an FM radio, right? There's certain channels on certain dials, and we all have to kind of live together and not step on each other. And so again, one of the biggest things in use in the park, right, is the park's federal, state, and local radio frequencies, right? They're used by law enforcement, law enforcement rangers, fire, EMS, right? Interpretive rangers, maintenance crews running around the park, roads crews, backcountry stuff. There's federal agencies. Then, on other frequencies are business band frequencies, things like, Xanterra, Delaware North, all the different operations that take to run those organizations, from housekeeping to maintenance, private road crews, right? So when you drive around the park and you see construction going on, they've got to use radios and not step on each other and deal with a lot of the same challenges that we deal with. And then, private tour guide operators, the wolf watchers, same deal. They're kind of all operating on the business band side of the house. You do have ham radio operators also in the park, right? People who have a license to operate a ham radio. They're using those in the park, as well as private citizens, as well as using them with some of the repeaters that are located around the area. And then last but not least, there's everybody else, visitors, families, folks on vacation, folks who live locally who use FRS and GMRS, which is what we're going to cover on this presentation. I'm not going to go into detail on what MERS is, but that is another, public radio frequency that they make radios for. There is, if you do want to know more about like what's operating in the park, what there is to listen to, what's out there, there is a great link here at the bottom of the presentation. Probably not too clickable for folks remotely, but again, that website gives a good overview of all the operations in the park that we know of, and all the different ins and outs of that. So what exactly is FRS and GMRS, right? I think most folks just think, hey, I got a two-way radio, a walkie-talkie. What is this thing, right? So FRS and GMRS are two terms, right? Family radio service is what FRS is, and then general mobile radio service is what GMSR is. But again, we all know them as walkie talkies, two-way radios. They're great for short range communications, right? You can buy them virtually anywhere, right? And you can use them for all sorts of stuff, right? Boating, camping, hiking, going on a cross country road trip. People give them to their kids to run around. They're pretty popular technologies. But FRS is the family radio service. There are absolutely no licensing requirements for it. You just go to Walmart, go to your local Target, go to wherever you want, go online and buy one, and you're off to the races. And they both operate on the same frequencies. So GMRS, which is licensed, which we'll go into more depth here in a minute, does require a license. But again, you don't need to know what frequencies you're using. You just kind of hop around channels and you can use them. But they do have distinct rules and regulations that operate them just to be aware of. But what I really like about them is that they kind of fit with the whole idea of, right, like being, open, accessible to the public. There's no special tests required to get one of these radios. It helps with that sort of community and common purpose of sharing information and disseminating information through the park, especially where, again, cell phones and data are troublesome. And again, I think it really is nice how everybody does their best to share what they're seeing, and it kind of helps make a better park experience for both regular visitors and guests who are on vacation happen to have a two-way radio. But as I mentioned, I think the biggest challenge in the park is the topography. So, whether you're a park employee or somebody using a business band radio or a ham or, a visitor using GMRS FRS, the topography of the park is the biggest barrier to entry. And, even the park can struggle with it at time. There's a lot of canyons, there's a lot of blind spots. One of the bigger workarounds that they have in place is, you can put a repeater up if you're the park, right? You go to top of Mount Washburn, install an antenna array, and then you have the ability to kind of overcome some of those topography challenges. But we don't have the benefit of that with the FRS and GMRS frequencies. Um, the other things that you can do is, have more watts on your radio and yell louder, or get a better antenna so you can hear and yell louder. But that still doesn't overcome, the physics of there being mountains in the way. And again, this image on the right, I think, kind of highlights that, right? So if you're at Old Faithful, right, you're in the cabins, behind Old Faithful Inn, and you want to talk down Basin all the way to Morning Glory or Riverside. That's not usually a problem, even with the cheapest off the shelf radios you can find. There's just nothing blocking you line of sight. But I think this illustrates how, if you want to talk to, say, somebody all the way up at Fountain, probably not. Like, with a regular FRS radio, you probably can't do that, and you definitely can't hear people from Great Fountain. And I think you see why. You've got a lot of topography in the way. But with GMRS radios, there is the ability to kind of stretch things and maybe push the limits a little bit further. So we'll kind of get into what is FRS, what is GMRS, and why would you want to use one over the other. So again, as I mentioned earlier, FRS is the family radio service. And for those of you who are, on, kind of like, well, what should I get? I think the easiest answer is FRS will cover 99% of what you want to do in the park, right? You're going to be able to talk down Basin. You can use, all 22 channels that FRS has. There are privacy tones, and we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a second. But privacy tones are kind of a misnomer. They're not really private. Anybody can listen to you using a private tone, but it just is a way for you to kind of filter out the fact that there's only 22 channels. And when there's a lot of people who want to use it, you might want to, again, not step on other people. So those privacy tones help with that. Again, FRS has no licensing requirement. It is limited in how much watt it can output. So, previously, to the late teens, it was half a watt, and that recently got updated to allow you to do up to 2 watts on certain channels. So again, there is a little bit more ability to talk louder on the radio, go a little bit further with it. But FRS radios have no licensing requirements. They can only transmit these lower power wattages, and you can't remove the antenna, and you can't use repeaters. But again, for most things in the park, that's good enough. And again, for folks that have those radios, there's no problem using those. But for anybody that's interested in pushing it a little bit further and maybe getting a little bit more range out of their radios, or maybe trying to do something silly like call fountain and be heard all the way in the Upper Geyser Basin, that's where GMRS radios come in, right? So they're still using the same 22 channels. You do get the option of using 8 repeaters as well, but again, there are no repeaters in the park. So for this presentation, we're just going to say that's cool, but you can't use it anyways on the repeaters. Same channels, same privacy tones. And the licensing requirement is actually really simple. It's $35, covers your whole family. There's no test, there's no memorizing, the ham radio technician stuff. It's just give the government 35 bucks. It gives you 10 years worth of usage. And again, it covers you and your immediate family. And then immediately now you can transmit up to 50 watts instead of just 2. You can change out the antenna, have external antennas, bigger antennas, silly looking antennas, tiny antennas if you want to just use them even shorter distance. And again, it opens up the repeaters. Again, there is a great guide I can't really cover how to apply for a GMRS license in this presentation. It's pretty, um, it's a federal application, so it takes a little bit of time to do. So there is a great article on the Rocky Talkie, which I think is a funny play on names. Rocky Talkie's blog has, they're also a radio manufacturer. They have a really good guide on how to apply for a GMRS license. And if you just Google, Rocky Talkie, how to get GMRS license, follow that guide. It'll walk through everything you need to know on how to get that license. But again, once you have it, you get a call sign and you're good for 10 years and don't really have to worry about it. All right. So what are these frequencies, right? I mentioned there's 22 frequencies that we all have access to. And I think most of us just refer to them by their channel number. You're not going to typically need to know or memorize any of this chart. But when you hear people talking about, go to 5, channel 4, those are really just different blocks of channels. And they all have different requirements. So channels 1 through 7 can transmit up to 2 watts on an FRS radio, up to 5 watts with a GMRS radio. Channels 8 through 14, those are the old, they used to be reserved just for FRS, but now they're open to everybody, both FRS and GRS. But you can see those are restricted to, again, a lower wattage, right? Only a half a watt transmit power. So, if you're using, channel 9, you probably can't be heard as far away, but that's probably a good thing if you're just chit chatting versus trying to do, again, downrange, down basin communications. Typically 4 and 5 are what are used, and you can see you can go up to 5 watts. Channels 15 through 22 is where things really get crazy, where you can start, in theory, transmitting up to 50 watts with a radio. But as you'll see when we talk about the radios in a minute, most of them max out at 5 or 8 watts on a handheld radio. Those 50-watt radios are real that can use channels 15 through 22. Those are really going to be, in your car, base station, like those big, old, I don't want to call them old fashioned, but like a CB style radio that can transmit those wattages. And again, it doesn't matter how loud how much you crank up the wattage, you can't shout through a mountain. So again, it doesn't help you too much in the park to go above that 5 or 10 watt maximum with a handheld. Again, there are 8 GMRS repeater frequencies that I didn't list on this table because we can't use those in the park. So we'll move on. What are the privacy tones? So again, when we'll talk about the channels, you'll hear, typically hear people say, go to 5, go to 5.5, go to 4.5. Well, that second number, right? The first number typically refers to the channel frequency. The second number refers to the privacy tone. And again, I jokingly call them, they're not so private privacy tones because anybody can hear you, even with a privacy tone. But what those are basically subaudible tones that we can't hear over the radio. They're just not audible, but the radio knows to open up the speaker when it hears its tone. So if a visitor's on channel 4 and they're on private tone 1, we won't hear them, right? They won't hear us. It's only when people overlap or transmit without a privacy tone that you can usually hear them. And then the newer radios that are coming out now have started to support the capability for what's called the digital code squelch. At the end of the day, or called the DCS. But at the end of the day, it does the same thing, right? The radio won't open up the speaker so you can hear people talking until it hears these codes. And I just listed the first five. There's dozens and dozens of codes. um, if you really want to, geek out and read, there's a great ham radio operator who put together this guide that I've linked at the bottom that explains the history of these tones and which manufacturer uses them and which ones are used by Midland and which ones are used by Motorola and Radio Shack back in the day when they still made radios. It's pretty exhaustive, but for most folks, you just need to know, hey, use four, use channel four, tone five. So did make a quick little chart of the kind of unofficial popular frequencies that we've seen kind of take off in the park over the last decade or so. The big ones that everybody should be familiar with is 4-5, and what that means is channel 4 at that frequency and a tone of 5. 4-5, 5-5, pretty popular. The other ones that are listed here, I've seen a lot of folks have those programmed on their radios. And what's important to know is again the wattage, how much you can transmit. But again, 4-5 is definitely what's used to talk amongst other gazers, other visitors, and that's the one the visitor center is monitoring. I'll add that in the Upper Geyser Basin, the visitor center does when they're able to listen to 4-5 and interact with everybody. But outside of the visitor center in the Upper Geyser Basin, I would call it rare to unheard of that they're using radios. The park does not carry around two-way radios like we do outside of the Upper Geyser Basin. Again, unless you get lucky and somebody's off work and you might be able to talk to them. But typically they're carrying those commercial, federal radios that can use the North repeaters and West repeaters. And that's where the bulk of their business takes place on. So I think we're actually pretty lucky that the park's willing to talk to us on 4-5. I think, again, it really opens up, makes for a better experience, makes the basins more accessible for a wider range of people, versus, in the rest of the park where it's kind of, radio silence, pun intended. So when you are using radio, what's some of the etiquette, that you should observe? I mean, I think the first thing that I want to point out here is that no one owns any of these frequencies, right? Nobody has exclusive rights over a frequency. It's all just a etiquette on using 4-5 and not talking over other people. So when you tune into a channel, one of the best things to do is listen for a second, right? Just make sure nobody else is using it, because it could be other gazers, it could be other visitors, it could be somebody having a personal conversation. Listen to a channel, see if it's available before you talk. When you are using a channel, always be polite. It is against the rules for using swear words or broadcasting music. Again, it's supposed to be meant for just brief two-way communications, in the manner that those frequencies are designated for. Always assume somebody's listening. There's nothing private about these radios. Even if you think you got a private line, they're easily listenable from other radios, from scanners, from all sorts of manners. So assume that everything you're saying is being heard by other folks, and don't want to get in trouble and lose the ability to use these radios. Something that always happens in the park is somebody has a radio in a bag and it's accidentally being keyed or going off by accident. It's not like a cell phone where they can hear you. If they're keying the radio, they can't hear you talking back. So try to do your best to make sure your radio doesn't bump up against something in your bag. And if you hear somebody looking for somebody with an open mic, try to help them out. But intentionally transmitting and keying somebody out or locking out a radio is technically illegal. I mean, again, the FCC is not sitting there in the Upper Geyser Basin listening to all the communications, but that's typically what they will go after folks for, is somebody who repeatedly tries to key out transmissions. It wasn't until I want to say the last year or two that they really started enforcing that. There was some, pretty egregious stuff that happened in some parts of the country where folks were keying out radios. But again, you have to do a lot of that to really get the ire of the FCC to come down on you. One of the other things is, you kind of see out there is, people see medical emergencies, people see crimes being committed or park level violations. My personal advice is always to, if you're in the Upper Geyser Basin and possible, call law enforcement first, like, or in parallel, call 911 on your cell phone, have somebody else help you and relay the information if it's medical. The interps at the visitor center might not be listening, and they're not law enforcement, so they can do their best to reach out to them, but try to do both at the same time if possible. I covered this already, but again, outside the Upper Geyser Basin, the park is not monitoring those frequencies, so don't call an emergency and expect them to respond. But that would be awesome if you're lucky enough to call an emergency outside the Upper Geyser Basin on the radio and somebody answers. And last but not least, I think all of us, we're all just visitors. Yelling at visitors and waving your radio around might get some unpopular attention or unnecessary attention. So again, try to be calm and collective with that. All right, so on to radio recommendations and what's out there, and again, try to cover something I think for everybody here. So just again, like I said, these FRS radios, they're available everywhere, at any store, any outdoor store, any big box store, online, you can get these radios. So, really low barrier to entry. So I call it the Midland series because again, they're cheap. You can get two of them for like $40. They're durable, they're affordable. They got micro USB charging. They're available everywhere. The only cons of these radios are, I'm being nitpicky, like, well, the world's kind of moving to USB-C for a charging standard. So they're a little bit inconvenient charging them in that manner, but they're great. I mean, they'll work. A lot of people have these radios, and I can't recommend them enough. The only other downsides is you can't, you know, upgrade the antenna. You're limited to what they can do from a transmission perspective. I also threw in a slide here for the Motorola series. I feel like they're, all reliable. Like they've been around forever. A lot of people have them, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with these radios. They work great. They've worked well forever. They'll continue working well. They're still making them. The newer ones that are coming out will probably upgrade the charging capabilities. They're available everywhere, but just like the Midlands, they're not upgradable from a power perspective, and they're not upgradable from an antenna perspective. The last sort of off the shelf, just grab it and go radio. I started seeing these around the park in the last couple of years, and at first I thought the pun was great, rocky talkie, but they are really nice radios in that they're super light, super compact. They're small. Their battery lasts like 5 or 6 days off of a charge. They can charge off a USB-C. They're pretty durable. They can go underwater, pretty foolproof. The only con with these things, really, I would say, is the cost. They're pretty pricey. You probably get 6 or 8 of the other radios for one of these. But starting to see these more and more out there with other visitors carrying them, and just wanted to call them out as, again, a nice, durable option if you wanted to stay on the FRS side of things and don't want to get a license. But as I mentioned, $35 and 10 years covering your entire family, just go get the license. It's great because then it opens up all sorts of other radios that you can get. So in the GMRS world, we're going to cover, probably the most popular radio that I've seen out there. And I couldn't find a picture that didn't have the bow, but I decided to leave it. But the Baofeng UV5 series radios. Now, they finally have made these, the UG5, the UV5G and the UV5X are now, again, officially certified versions of the radio that are compliant with all FCC regulations for GMRS transmission. And man, are they cheap. I mean, 2 radios for like $20, 2 radios for $30. They can monitor 2 things at once. You can transmit on multiple channels. I think everybody who's familiar with the park has seen these everywhere. But their biggest con is they're difficult. Not impossible to program without Chirp, and we'll talk a little bit about Chirp here in a second. But Chirp is a program that's used to program a lot of these radios, like the Baofangs, like the Oceans. They're now making an optional USB-C battery. It doesn't come with it, but you can go buy the USB-C battery, and then you don't have to carry a special charger. You can just charge it with the same thing that's charging your cell phone, which is pretty handy. But my only point of caution is at this point in time, don't go and buy the UV5R, the ham radio version. There's just no benefit to getting that anymore now that they make this version. You can transmit on all the GMRS frequencies, all the FRS frequencies. and you can't on anything else. If you program these radios to transmit on the Wolf Watcher frequency or your local fire department's frequency and press the button, they won't do that no matter what you try to tell it to do. So um, again, this is the kind of the lowest cost barrier to entry product, the Baofeng UV 5G. If you want to step up a little bit, the next option that's kind of my personal favorite and the one that I have here is the Baofeng BTEC GMRS V2. Again, like all the other radios, you can put whatever antenna you want on them. Again, they have now the USB-C charging battery. I hope this comes through on the camera, but give it a try. You've got the USB-C charging. You have two buttons, two push-to-talk buttons, 1A, 1B. You can monitor 2 channels. Again, kind of gives you that versatility. It's a little bit bulkier than the previous model, but again, difficult to program, but not impossible without chirp. It's pretty easy. Just go into the chirp and add your frequencies. But again, this has come out with their V2 version in the last year or so, and it comes with that USB-C battery. And I'll say my only complaint about them is just longevity. If you're using them year after year out there in the park in the rain and the snow and whatnot, eventually they do wear out, but they're not super expensive. And then going back to that Rocky Talkie company, they've now have this product that just announced a couple months ago. Again, a super simple, durable 5-watt GMRS version. It can monitor 2 channels. And if you see by the picture, there's not a lot to it. It's just a small little radio, swappable antenna, pick the channel, pick the frequency, and you're good. Only problem with this one, same as the other one, it's expensive. It's a lot more than the other radios. You can probably buy 2 or 3 of the other radios for the cost of one of these. Last but not least, if you really want to be nerdy, there's the Wushin or Ocean series of radios. They're just a different animal. I've got one right here. They use a different chip on the inside of them for how they transmit and receive. So they're what it's called a super heterodyne radio, and I'll pretend I know what that means. But what it really means is that you don't have as much bleed over. So if you were to drive by with your Baofeng radio by the ranger station or over by the snow lodge, occasionally you'll see your radio kind of go crazy. And that's just because there's other frequencies operating on that microwave tower over there that bleed over into these Baofeng radios because they're just a simple system on a chip or sock rate receiver. The super heterodyne radios are a little bit more well engineered, so that doesn't happen. It's also a true dual receiver radio, so if you can listen to 2 frequencies at once and you'll hear both of them at the same time because it's not prioritizing which one over the other. It's literally tuning to both at the same time, and you can transmit on 2 frequencies. Downside to this radio, it's expensive. Again, it's just like the Rocky Talkie. You can get a couple of the other radios for the price of this. I would say it's pretty much impossible to program this without chirp. They ship these radios with like 999, they'll call them like bug out channels and programmed in there. So every possible frequency on the planet that they can do and can monitor. So you're really going to want to program those with chirp. They have a USB-C battery that's optional. So again, you can charge the battery with a USB-C, but it doesn't follow the standard. Like if you have like an iPhone or an Android or any laptop charger, if you plug the Baofeng USB-C radio into those chargers, they'll charge. This thing does not. It doesn't seem to actually follow the USB-C standard to the T. So there's some improvement they need to do there. The antenna types are a little different with these radios. So these antenna type are called SMA, and there's SMA female and SMA male. And as you can see, they're a little different between the 2 radios. And so that may be something if you're already invested in a whole bunch of antennas for your radio, it's going to be an adapter or a switch to a different antenna. And my last little joke here is once you get into this radio, you're one very small step from, ham radio level of nerdiness with these things. So go get your technician license and, take the next step up in tech with those. Now with the GMRS radios, you do get some upgrade options. Again, the FRS radios work great in the park, work great in the Upper Geyser Basin. But if you do want to push things a little bit further and see if you can talk, from Upper Geyser Basin to Lower Geyser Basin and vice versa, some of the antenna upgrades that are worth taking a look at, I've listed here. The Nagoya, I got the Nagoya NA 701C, but basically it's an antenna that is tuned in to the frequencies that we're using, right? So it's really tuned in that same 460th megahertz um, range, and it's flexible, it's light. It doesn't, if you're riding on your bike, you're not going to accidentally hit this antenna and knock it out of your bag. Again, that flexibility helps. And it's a decent upgrade over some stock antennas. I would say it's not a huge upgrade over maybe the antennas that come on the Rocky Talkies or the Ocean or Wushin radios. But again, for the Baofangs, that's usually a pretty good upgrade. And then I can't find my what you call rubber ducky antenna down here, but that Nagoya NA810. That's really when you just want to use these radios outside the park or just for short distances. Like, hey, we're using them to talk, back at the trailer or something like that, or talk to our kid. This actually limits the range, makes the radio much more small, and makes the radio more portable. So again, you kind of have that optionality here of I'm in the park, I want to go long. I'm back at home. I don't need all that antenna. I don't need to talk to people 15 miles away. You can grab one of these little Nagoya small rubber ducky antennas, and that's an option there as well. Last but not least, I think when we talk about like what is the maximum range you can kind of get out of these radios, I think that really comes to being in a good position from an elevation perspective, but also moving the antenna outside of the car. So, the thing that block the signals are, the glass in your car, the metal in your car. And so with a base antenna, it typically takes a base antenna mount, which I've listed here, and then the actual antenna array that's tuned to, just like these are tuned to the same frequency we're using. You want an antenna that's tuned to that frequency. And then depending on, again, which radio you have, you're going to need an adapter that converts to SMA female so you can screw them into Baofeng radios. If you have one of the Wushin or Ocean radios, you don't need this adapter. But again, if you really want to go crazy and, be able to talk to people from pretty far away, again, remembering that topography is still your limiting factor, this is my recommendation for what you can get for car antenna tech. So you've upgraded, you've gotten your GMRS license, you are ready to start programming your radio, and then you're like, oh, I've got to use this chirp program. I could probably do a whole another hour-long presentation just on how to use chirp. But what I will say about it is that, again, it's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's programmable. It's used to program Baofeng, BTEC, Wushin, pretty much most of the Chinese brand of radios that are out there. It's a little bit silly and clunky, and it's easy to make mistakes with the program. But the GMRS versions of those radios that I showed you, even if you make a mistake, they won't let you key those frequencies. So it's still very safe for the radios that were recommended here. But never again, using that program to transmit or program a ham radio to transmit on GMRS or FRS frequencies is still technically illegal. And now that there are radios that we don't need to buy anymore that can do that, there's really no benefit to programming ham radios with this. There is a great video here on how to use chirp. It's over 20 minutes long, done by a YouTube channel called Not a Rubicon. He kind of has like a snarky, like joke persona to his regular channel, but his chirp radio guide is not snarky. It's just him being himself, talking about how to use chirp. So if you want to get into chirp and understand how to use it, I recommend watching that video. Explain how to program those radios using chirp. And, again, kind of once you get beyond the sort of how the heck is this program supposed to work aspect, it's not that complicated. But again, that first learning curve is steep. The last thing I'll just want to mention is the programming cables that you use to program the radios. This is basically the FTD cable. And the key is to get one from a reputable source online, because again, sometimes there are versions that are knockoffs. But basically, this turns your USB port into giving you the ability to kind of plug into the radio's microphone and speaker jack. And so once you kind of plug that in there and then hook it up to your computer, you can then use Chirp to program it. I also use an adapter on it nowadays because USB-C is becoming again more and more of the standard. So I have a USB-C to USB-A adapter, so I can plug it into my computer, which doesn't have any USB-A ports. But again, Chirp. If anybody has any questions about Chirp, there's lots of folks who are more than happy to help you learn it or help you program your radios or get you over that learning curve. So, if you do have any questions about Chirp, feel free to reach out or talk to anybody that you see who appears to know what they're doing with radios. The last question that we get about programming radios a ton is it legal to listen to the park and other frequencies in the park? And this has kind of come up a bunch in the last year or two. And so I just pulled this right from the superintendent's compendium, which again, just like everything else, I'll go back to my disclaimer at the beginning. This is my interpretation of it. This is a copy and paste from it, but that document is updated from Cam and the park superintendent annually. So what the wording that's in this presentation at the moment, as we're transmitting this, as we're recording this, may not be what's in there in 3, 6, 9 months, but as of right now, the key takeaway is that, if you're using the radio and you're sitting at Grand and you're listening to the park talking on their park frequencies and you're just curious and you don't get up or do anything about it, that's probably, in my personal opinion, not illegal. But if you hear them say on the radio that there's, wolves and a bear down at Riverside, and you get up and go pursue, track, or harass wildlife and get in trouble, they could throw the book at you because you have a radio capable of doing that. So use your own discretion as to whether or not you want to monitor the park with your two-way radios. Again, this is the current regulation that's in the superintendent's compendium. And again, use your better judgment for whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze, so to say, for listening to park transmissions. So that's all I had for this presentation. I guess we'll open it up to Q&A. And again, there is a little bit of a delay between the live stream and the Q&A. So give folks a minute or two to ask some questions. While you're asking your questions, I'm just going to pull up a slide here that shows the next presentations, the rest of the schedule that we have here for the rest of the winter season. And yeah, if folks have any questions, go ahead and put it into the chat on YouTube Live, and I'll do my best to answer. And it's weird talking into the void without anybody to interact with, so. Cool. Is my mic muted right now? Cool. Went through that in under an hour. It's a lot to cover.
All right. Thank you everybody for coming. This is Will. We will have the talk next week with Tara Cross for the introduction to Giant. If any of you guys have any questions afterwards, feel free to fill out like our GOSA contact page. You can get questions over to Art. I know a lot of you guys know Art personally, so feel free to reach out to Art. I guess actually, Mara has actually put a question in here. So, what is the most frustrating thing about radios to you? Let me unmute you. There you go.
Yeah, I think the most frustrating thing for me usually is battery life. You know, that can be a challenge, right? I think, there's nothing worse than, having it on all day and seeing something and then you go to press the transmit button and it's dead. So that's why I really kind of in the presentation talked a lot about, hey, now there's USB-C radios or batteries, so that's been really helpful. Um, the other frustrating thing I'd say about the radios is just the trying to figure out like what's the right channel, what's the right mix of channels, to get that range. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's more of a technology thing of just the battery not lasting all day, and that's where I think the USB-C charging will be helpful. All right. Well,
Okay. Well,
thanks, Will. I'll turn it back over to you. I don't see any other questions,
nope.
and
And I think that's all we have. So thank you everybody for attending. And this is our first run. We'll definitely make things a little bit better as we go forward. And all the information, if you forget, is on the GOSA website for the presentations for the rest of the spring. So stay warm out there in our lackluster winter that we've been having. But we'll see everybody soon.